Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about spiral dynamics in relation to human evolution and the integration of the divine feminine. Alright, so before I get further into the video, I basically wanted to say that this is actually the fourth video in a series of loosely related videos. So the first one that I did was on yin and yang. The next one was about systems thinking, and the one after that was about the integration of the divine feminine into the individual and society at large. And so this one is about spiral dynamics in relation to the integration of the divine feminine. And so basically, if you wanted to, you could go back and you could watch those other videos first before you watch this one, or you can just listen to this video because I'm going to give you enough information to be able to understand without having to go back and watch all those videos. And then you can choose to go back and watch them if you want to, but if not, that's okay too. So basically, in those videos, in my yin and yang one, I was talking about how yin and yang energy are basically these polar subtle energies that don't really have an expression on their own, but they come together in combination to create everything in our world that we see. So every living and non-living system is created by the conjunction of yin and yang together, and they're never separate. And then the next video I talked about systems thinking, and basically what a system is a series of parts that have a relationship with one another and they produce a particular function. So for example, like your body is a system and it consists of various different parts that all work together to make your system go. So a lot of different things are systems. So one example of a system would be the individual human psyche, and another example would be like a society. And for our intents and purposes for this video, those are the main systems that we're going to be talking about. Then in my third video, I went into the topic of the integration of the divine feminine. Basically, because society doesn't have a very positive association with the feminine principle and with yin energy, we have a bit of an issue with suppressing it and trying to keep it out from our societies and from ourselves as individuals. We really might not be aware of this because we might not be used to like labeling things as such, so we might not be used to thinking, oh well, that's an expression of the divine feminine, but nonetheless the repression is still there. And so in that video I really labored the point that it's very important for us as individuals to accept whatever energies we have there, whether it be yin or whether it be yang, and then also to understand that us as individuals repressing the divine feminine out of ourselves really affects society as a whole, and it has an impact on how well our system works. And so one of the impacts of having the restriction of the divine feminine is that we don't really value nature as much as, let's say, things like the economy. And so we have a tendency to prioritize more yang things at the expense of more yin things, which makes ourselves cut off from the divine feminine. So in a nutshell, that's basically what those videos were about. So I'm going to be taking that topic and talking about them from a different perspective. Basically, I'll be taking it and looking at it from the spiral dynamics perspective. Alright, so one caveat that I want to give before I get going into talking about spiral dynamics is to mention that it is just a system. It's just a model. It's not really something to take super seriously. It just is a very useful guideline for seeing how people and how societies sort of evolve. And so basically, the idea behind spiral dynamics, which was created by Clare Graves, is that human societies evolve in a predictable way. So basically, they have to go through particular stages, and with each stage comes a different kind of social order or social structure. And likewise, a person has to pass through those same phases to get to higher and higher levels of awareness and to get to a more evolved perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of the stages of spiral dynamics real quick and kind of tell you how it works, just so you get the idea. That way, later on in the video, I can sort of tie it back into the integration of the divine feminine and how human society has evolved in relation to our feelings about yin and yang, and how we came to experience divine feminine repression in the first place. All right, so spiral dynamics is called spiral dynamics because it basically is made in the shape of a spiral, this whole model. And basically, the spiral starts at a really, really small point, and then it starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger as we get more and more evolved as people and as societies. So the stages at the lower part of the spiral and the smaller part of the spiral, they're less evolved, and then those, as you get further and further up, you get more and more and more evolved. Now, having said that, it's very important to realize that each one of these stages is very, very important and necessary for growth and development on the individual and societal level. So a society can't really skip stages. You know, it's something that has to be gone through. Each stage has to be integrated. So imagine like you have a ladder, right? So imagine that you wanted to be on the top rung of the ladder, but then you didn't have any of the other rungs underneath of it because you thought that the other rungs were bad. Well, it wouldn't be a very good ladder, would it? Basically, each stage builds upon the last stage and all of its ideologies and all of its technological advancements and all of the good things that it brings to human society. So keep in mind as we go through this, don't think that any particular stage is bad or unimportant or anything like that. Also, one thing that you'll notice as the stages progress is that they tend to oscillate back and forth between individual focus and collective focus. It's like focus toward everyone in the society. So you'll notice that. So, for example, the first one is pretty much focus as a singular person, like trying to survive, whereas the second phase is more about like settling into a tribal community where the tribe is most important. So you'll see that same kind of dynamic going back and forth at various points in the spiral. All right, so the very first phase within the spiral is the beige phase. And basically this phase is geared towards survival. And it's really just one person or maybe a handful of people sort of working together just to survive. You know, it's sort of like hunter-gatherer, very low-tech kind of situation. And basically, in this phase, a person is totally reliant on the cycles of Mother Nature to really provide what they need. You know, so in later phases, they have like the society to sort of lean back on. But in this phase, it's mostly just every person for themselves and everyone just trying to survive the best way they can. So it's a very, very low-tech kind of stage, and there's not really anybody any society around in the world that's still in that because it's not even yet a society. Now this correlates mostly to like the baby phase, you know, the very earliest time where they're basically completely dependent on their mother. So think of this phase, the people within this phase, as being completely dependent on Mother Nature, you know, and not really having any kind of technological advancement or anything like that. You know, just like a baby, you know, like it has to have all of its needs met by the mother. And so that's the heart of the beige phase. All right, so the next phase is the purple phase, and basically this phase shifts over more collective. And so this is all about when human societies sort of became tribal and everybody settled into these little communities. And the main focus there would be on the family and serving the tribe, and there was also like a focus toward magical thinking. And so those are really the hallmarks of that phase. Now the purple phase still corresponds kind of like to the baby phase, but it's more so the baby phase when the baby isn't just interacting only with the mother. You know, it's when the baby starts to get to know other family members and gets a sense of being part of a family. All right, so the next phase is individual focused again, and it's the red phase, also called the warlord phase. Basically, from those tribal societies rise the strongest, most aggressive person. And basically that person, you know, starts to lead things, and, you know, they basically want a conquest, and they want, you know, their will to be the thing that's done. And they think of their will as like the most important thing in the universe. Basically, everything is centered around that one person's ambitions and wants, and then everybody else kind of goes along with it, you know, so they're basically following this like one hyper-aggressive leader. Now in human form, you could say that this phase is kind of like the toddler phase. It's when the toddler learns the word no, and they want to do whatever it is they want to do, and they throw tantrums, and you know, it can be quite a brutal phase if you've ever been through that phase as a parent, as I have, you know. And so basically, when it comes to toddlers and when it comes to the leaders in the warlord phase, again, everything in the universe is, to them, is centered around their own desires, their own needs, their own wants, and then basically to heck with everyone else. You know, they're just not developed enough to see that maybe they should be catering to other people's needs too. Now, there might be a tendency to try to like look down on this phase and think, oh, well, you know, couldn't we have just skipped that part in the spiral? You know, that seems like, you know, kind of a yucky phase to have to go through. But at the same time, like, every phase in the spiral is important. So it would be kind of like saying, like, let's say if you had a ladder, it's like, well, I don't necessarily like the third rung of the ladder. Could we just like maybe not have that rung? It's like, well, no, then you have a less safe ladder to climb up. All right, so after humanity passes through the red phase, basically society gets really fed up with like the kind of chaos that comes with that warlord sort of way where, you know, there's conquesting and everything, and we settle back into a more communal type of situation. And basically, you know, the idea is that we want to keep the animal impulses that created that red situation under control. And we want to basically civilize everything and create complex institutions and civilization and have clear set laws and make sure that things run a particular way. And this tends to also be very hierarchical in nature. So it's a very organized kind of structure. And there are still people alive on the planet today that kind of function this way. You know, even though like you could say that maybe about 100 years ago most people were that way, but now more people are in the phase after it. So people who are more conservative might tend to resonate with this phase. Basically has to do with social institutions and making sure that society runs well and it values conformity and making sure that children are taken care of and are raised up the proper way. And, you know, there are a lot of different rules for behavior that are expected to be followed. And people within this phase are really interested in preserving social institutions. So the church, the school, you know, the country, the community that they're in, that's like the most important thing. You know, they tend to, you know, be very patriotic. You know, they tend to be very particular about their values and think that their values are the absolute right way and that other variations on their values are just, you know, like wrong. So we could relate this blue phase really back to like times later on in childhood where a child starts to learn the rules of the family, and they might think of those rules as like really absolute and rigid. So if a child like visited another person's family, they might be like, well, my family doesn't do things that way, so that's the wrong way to do them, you know. And they might feel very uncomfortable in that situation because children, let's say between the ages of 4 and 11, you know, they really need a really set idea that these are the right things, these are the wrong things, and they need kind of an assurance that, you know, please let me be doing the right things, you know. So if a child doesn't really have a clear idea of what's right and what's wrong when they're children, you know, they don't know how to get the praise from their parents that they want. And so that's a lot of the same kind of mentality from the blue phase societally too, because there tends to be a God-like figure, and they want to make sure that they're doing things that are pleasing for the God-like figure. Likewise, children in that society want to make sure that they're doing things that are pleasing for their parents. They want a clear sense of this is definitely right and this is definitely wrong. All right, so the next phase is the orange phase. And so since blue was collective, it skews again more individualistic. And so whenever a person who's at the end of blue starts to question, you know, whether things are absolutely right or absolutely wrong, they might tend to have a tendency to go over to the orange stage. And in the orange stage, there's a birth of rationalism. You know, there tends to be maybe even a rejection of traditional religious ideas, you know, like sort of like sloughing up the dogma of the past and taking a more scientific approach to things. And then there also tends to be a focus toward the individual in the sense that, you know, like a person might want to be the best in their given field, and they might think that success and like having particular things or particular accolades might be the point of life. So they tend to be very materialistically focused, and they also tend to be all about like sort of almost climbing in hierarchies in terms of excellence. So in red, you know, that hierarchy was basically like whoever's the most ruthless, whoever, you know, can push their will on things the most. With orange, it's whoever is able to, let's say, provide the best service or be the best or outcompete other people. And so it's a much more evolved form of that individualistic drive compared to red. Now, when it comes to human development, this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky, because the thing is, some people never quite leave the blue stage, and then some people never like really actually get to orange. You know, so you would say that maybe the people who do get to orange, let's say in their teen years at some point in time, you know, they basically have to develop you know, a kind of iconoclasm of sorts, where they start to question traditional norms and they start to question the norms of their family. So some go through this phase and some don't. Now the next phase up on the spiral is the green phase, and again it skews more collective in its focus. So the green phase tends to sort of reject the materialism that comes from orange, and they tend to start focusing more on like, you know, like what's best for the global society. So at this point, because of orange opening up you know, sort of possibilities in terms of like inventing more global technology like the internet, you know, is a very orange invention. But at the same time, because of those inventions, we can then move to a different perspective where we can see lots of different communities of people that we were maybe before not super connected to. And the idea here is that there's an ecological like focus toward sustainability, toward green energy. Those things are very green. You know, focusing on social issues that impact people who are in, let's say, minority groups or women, you know, that would be an example of green. But basically the main focus is on making society a fair and equal place for people to live, and, you know, to make sure that our air is clean and that our planet is clean. You know, veganism comes up in this. Now again, this one doesn't really necessarily relate to a particular phase in human development, because some people never make it to green. And so, you know, you could probably find a lot of green people who are interested in, let's say, like social justice movements or movements toward like, you know, ecological awareness, people who are interested in getting rid of income inequality. A lot of people on the left tend to skew a little bit green. So these are people who would be more in this phase. So that's basically tier 1 of the spiral. So what tier 1 is about is basically these are the very most localized phases. So everyone in each one of these phases will think that their perspective is the superior perspective. So people in orange will think that orange is the best, and people in green will think that green is the best, and people who are in red will think that red is the best. So they don't really have a sense for the other points on the spiral, and they'll have a tendency to think that they're less valid or to demonize them in some way or another. And so if it comes to, like, let's say evolving to the next phase, they might resist that, moving to the next phase, because they see people in the next phase as being somehow lesser than them. Or they might look down on the stage before them and say, oh, look at them, you know, they're so primitive, you know. And, you know, so this becomes a problem where a person becomes really, really stuck in their phase. And so that happens in tier 1, but in tier 2, there's like a huge jump between green and yellow. Now, according to spiral dynamics, less than 1% of the population is in yellow. So in yellow, the focus skews again back more individualistic. And basically what yellow is the ability for big picture thinking and systems thinking. So yellow understands that it's kind of operating from its own perspective, and it doesn't demonize other perspectives, and it tends to see all of the other perspectives as having value within the spiral. And so when yellow thinks about problems, it thinks about problems like systemically and non-personally. and just kind of notices how a particular system works so that they can kind of almost engineer the problem in such a way that they can make the system better. You know, they sort of understand the root causes to problems, and they tend to be non-reactive and dispassionate, and they sort of are able to engineer whatever actually is best for the system, you know, because they're not just looking at the symptoms of a problem, they're looking at the root causes. So in this video, what we're really going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the issue of the disintegration of the divine feminine from a more yellow perspective. So the idea would be that we want to be moving society and ourselves more toward wherever the next stage is in the spiral to make it more possible for us to integrate the divine feminine. Basically, because society is mostly orange, we want to start maybe pushing things a little bit more in the green direction, because the green direction is really when the divine feminine can really start to be integrated. Now there's another phase above that called turquoise, and I'm not really sure what turquoise entails. I've looked up a lot of different things on it before, but I wasn't able to find anything like really of substance that was really clear, like, oh, that's definitely what turquoise is. So for me, that phase still sort of floats in the ether. And then they've also mentioned that there's a coral phase above that, and I wouldn't even know what that entails. So I'm just going to work with those first 7 stages where yellow is the highest one. So basically what I'm going to be doing in this video is sort of talking about this whole spiral through the yellow perspective, and we're going to be tying in the topic of the divine feminine and seeing, you know, at which phases it is that the divine feminine can be integrated. So basically what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about our relationship to yin and yang as we move through each one of these stages. Alright, so if we look at the stage that's beige, basically that's all about individual human beings, or maybe like groups of just a few human beings, and they're going through and they're just hunting and gathering, and they're basically foraging for whatever they can find. You know, they haven't yet discovered like farming and agriculture or anything like that yet. Basically, they're having to rely completely on Mother Nature and the natural cycles of Mother Nature to meet their needs. And like I said before, this is like that baby phase that we have where we're completely dependent on the mother. And so in this stage, yin energy is the dominant energy. Now I spoke about this in my past video. Basically, yin energy is an expression of the divine feminine, and the expressions of which are part of the feminine principle. So it has everything to do with Mother Nature, you know, and being, and just pure existence. And so when we were in the beige phase, this was a polarly yin phase. And, you know, given that it's polarly yin, the issue with being imbalanced in the yin direction, or polarly yin, is that it really, it's a real threat to our survival. You know, if we don't really have that much of a wedge between ourselves and nature, essentially what our main impetus is going to be to give ourselves more and more refuge from the unpredictability of nature, and to try to bring things more into our own control as human beings. And, you know, the threat of not surviving is very, very real, because if there's, let's say, a storm that comes along, or a drought or something like that, you know, people are really vulnerable to those forces. All right, now in the next phase, we're starting to become a little bit more technologically advanced. You know, we're starting to basically settle into tribal societies where we can do some farming and things like that. And basically, we start to be able to take our power more in our hands. And so basically, in a sense, us settling into tribal societies was us cutting ourselves off from nature the very first time. So imagine this is like a huge wound, basically, like, and it's called the mother wound. So we're basically chopping ourselves out from Mother Nature, and we're saying, no, we don't want that. We're going to reject that. We want to do something else over here where we don't have to worry about the unpredictability of Mother Nature. Alright, so this initial mother wound between this beige stage and this purple stage, that's where the resistance to the feminine principle started. So I talked a lot in my video about the fact that, you know, society has basically gone through many different phases, and basically with our technological advancements, we're trying to get further and further away from nature, and that being the impetus of having a polarly masculine society, like a polar patriarchy of sorts. And because of that, basically, yang energy comes to be at the forefront, but yin energy tends to be suppressed, and the divine feminine suppressed with it, which is the feminine aspect of God. And so as we grow through our human societies, basically we do without the divine feminine in most of it, but we're coming up to a point where we can finally start to integrate that. And so that was what that video was about, the importance of, right now trying to integrate the divine feminine back into society. But if we look back at our beige phase, we can see that initially, the feminine posed us such a grave threat that we had to extricate ourselves from the feminine. We had to repress it away. And so the beginning of that was the tribal phase, the purple phase. Now, there was a lot of magical thinking, and basically all of our religion was based around the spirits and nature. So the feminine was still very much a part of these societies, and they still had to think a lot in terms of like the cycles of Mother Nature. So it wasn't like they were fully walled off from Mother Nature. So in a sense, these societies were still balanced with regard to yin and yang, because even though there was that repression going on, ultimately what was happening was that we weren't able to repress in a very effective way, because Mother Nature was still dominant over us, but we just had a little bit more personal autonomy and control over our situation. And so yin and yang were not out of balance yet. Now in the warlord phase, we drifted even further away from the feminine principle. Basically, anything that has to do with hyper-individuality and anything that's not like species-focused is going to be very yang in nature. And so because of the brutality of this time, and because of the fact that really nobody's emotions were really valued other than those warlords, and ultimately, they were very, very hardened and, like very almost criminal themselves. So there wasn't room for really very much yin energy at all. And so I would say that this is really the beginning of the complete suppression of the yin, at least on the human level. Now, again, we were still not completely out of the woods with, dealing with the unpredictability of nature. We weren't quite walled off from it. So in a sense, you could say that even though things were pretty imbalanced within the context of the society, ultimately, the fact that, people at the time had to really schedule their lives around Mother Nature gave a sort of balance where there was a kind of balance between yin and yang, and we weren't really stepping on Mother Nature's toes yet. Now the next phase is blue, where we start to focus on human invention a little bit more in terms of like our social structures and how they function. So you think about that as a technology in and of itself. And ultimately we became even more walled off from Mother Nature in a more effective way. Our infrastructure was better. We started to come up with like various medicines and things like that. We had specialization at this point where we didn't always have to focus on finding food, and there could be all kinds of different professions within a blue society. And so ultimately, at this point in time, we've kind of been more effective at walling ourselves off from nature, and so even less yin came into play there. And so we started to skew more polarly yang. Also, because of the rigidity of the rules within that society and the fact that like people's morality was heavily policed in those kind of societies, it basically created a really extreme repression, making it to where like we weren't as in touch with our own animal instincts, and so ultimately with that, there was even more of a repression of yin, not just on the outside in terms of walling ourselves off from nature in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of walling ourselves from our own animalistic nature, so that we see ourselves only as civilized and completely try to ignore the fact that we have appetites of any kind. And so you can see this with a lot of religions coming out of blue societies, tend to be really big on focusing on sin and, you know, certain conscriptions for behavior, like these are the good things to do and these are the bad things to do, and you must absolutely not do the bad things, and yes, absolutely do the good things. So this also brought us into conflict with our natural instincts and our emotions. And so again, we're walling off from nature, from the inside and from the outside at this point. And so society is skewing even more yang. But at this point, we're still not completely imbalanced, because ultimately, humanity is not causing that much harm to nature. Now then we go over to the orange phase, and basically at this point, humanity sort of opens up to this whole level of industrialization. And the idea comes to be about optimization and capitalism and making sure that, you know, we have a surplus of stuff and a surplus of food, and that we have, you know, everything that we could possibly want or need, and all of these status symbols and an infrastructure for, you know, being successful within. And, you know, everybody wants to create their own business or do this or do that. And they get so focused on a lot of materialistic wants and a lot of desires for accolades that they start to lose sight of the fact that maybe some of these inventions are starting to cause a strain on the planet. And at this point, you know, we're already repressed in terms of our animal instincts and our emotions, and we're already pretty well walled off from nature because our infrastructure has started to grow even stronger. And so this is really where we are at as a species, you know, where we've basically very effectively walled ourselves off from the divine feminine. You know, we've been very, very successful at repressing it away, and we've walled ourselves off from nature. And so we've come to the point now where that yang energy is polarly imbalanced, to the point where we're now at a crisis point, where we have to start actually doing our best to start integrating the divine feminine back into our society. And this is really what brings us such a great need to move more toward green and toward yellow. You know, so ultimately at green we start to focus more on ecological concerns and more toward lots of different groups of people and toward emotions and toward our natural instincts, and we start to question various narratives that we've been handed down from blue traditions and from orange society. And so, you know, ultimately this is really the crux of where we're at as a society, where we're right now. We have quite a bit of blue, a lot of orange, and quite a bit of green. And what we want to do is we want to keep shifting people more toward the direction of green. You know, get more blue people to go orange and get more orange people to go green, basically. But ultimately, the full integration of the divine feminine can't really happen at green yet, because it's just not really a deep enough phase where it's seeing the real roots of the problem. And I would even suspect that at yellow, a person couldn't really fully start integrating the divine feminine. I would imagine that it's probably turquoise or above, or maybe it doesn't even relate back to the spiral dynamics model in that exact kind of way. I just know that for me, I tend to be pretty good at systemic thinking and to kind of break down a topic to its core, and I still have issues with the disintegration of the divine feminine in myself. And so I would imagine that this is something that's going to be a process. That said, I think it's important for this process to start, because in many ways I fear that time may be of the essence for the human race to be able to do this. I think of it as kind of a time-sensitive thing, because it has to do with the cycles of nature. And so I'm afraid that if we continue like going through with our orange mentality, where it's all about getting bigger and better things and status, and, you know, really focusing toward materialism, what might end up happening is that we end up basically allowing our human technology to sort of basically destroy the planet or to throw some major cycles off permanently or something like that. And so I would think that the main way to remedy that is to get people like moving their consciousness more in the direction toward green, where those ecological concerns start to come up and we start to be maybe a bit more connected to our emotions and having compassion for people and things too. I think that's a very positive thing. So basically I'm focusing on it this way because I'm afraid that time is of the essence, and I think that, letting people know this can help people really try to see which is the direction to go in that's really going to help humanity at the place where it's at. And so one way you can do that is by whatever phase you happen to be on the spiral to shift yourself forward. So like, don't try to jump all the way to green if you're not in green. So if you are like, let's say in blue, try to shift yourself forward to orange, and if you're in orange, try to shift yourself forward to green. If you're in green, try to shift yourself forward to yellow. Ultimately, you're trying to make the jump between the phase you're at now and the phase that's in the future, because ultimately we need the whole spiral to kind of be moving in the direction of progress. And so basically anything that we do to move the whole spiral forward is going to put us in a much better position and in a much more receptive position to have the divine feminine integrated. Because once you get past orange, ultimately, it's safe enough to integrate the divine feminine. In a pre-orange society, it's not really that safe. Ultimately there are technological advancements and ideological advancements that need to happen before we're even equipped to handle the integration of the divine feminine. But once we get to green, that's when we can really start to integrate the divine feminine. So basically what you want to do with this system of spiral dynamics is you want to kind of self-diagnose, and you want to say, kind of peg yourself for where you're at on the spiral. There's a tendency for people to want to estimate up because they think of like higher phases as better. So there are people who will like arbitrarily be like, oh yeah, I'm yellow, or oh, I'm up there at turquoise, or I'm at coral, or something like that. But ultimately just be really, really honest with yourself about where you are. They basically estimate that, a person will give themselves 2 extra steps than where they're at. So a person at blue will think they're at green, and a person at orange, will think that they're at yellow. So keep that in mind. I would recommend estimate down a little bit if you're not sure. And so once you know where you're at on the spiral, ultimately what you can try to do is you can try to bring yourself forward to whatever is the next step on the spiral. And this will ultimately make us more receptive as a whole entire species, because what will happen is, as we move through these phases and as more and more people go more toward the green, it basically opens us up to a possibility where the divine feminine can actually come to fruition. And this is true even if you're, let's say, somebody who's in blue who's moving to orange. So basically orange is where the problem comes in, where, now it's like a dire situation where the divine feminine has to be integrated because of the impact of our business orientedness on the earth. So you might think, well, it's like, well, if I'm in blue, maybe I don't want to necessarily go forward to orange. But it's important to keep society moving through the spiral, and to do that as quickly as possible because we don't want to run out of time. So basically self-diagnose and then try to formulate a way to move yourself forward on the spiral. So you can do a lot of contemplation to do this, basically seeing through the illusion of whatever your worldview is, and it'll move you forward slowly. If we get a lot of people to do this, this will have a great collective effect. Now on the collective level, we can also have influence no matter what phase we're at, if we can see value in moving people in society more toward those higher levels like green. So we can advocate for green technology, or green causes. And a lot of people have resistance to green because it's like one of the main struggles that we have today is the struggle between orange and green. And you can find that a lot of people who are in orange like really tend to dislike green a lot and have an aversion to it. And even people who are like into like spiral dynamics I've seen on a forum that I follow, they're like, oh, can I skip over green? I really don't want to be in green because it's so not what I want to do. So ultimately there's a lot of resistance to green. And so if you're a person who's in resistance to green, what I recommend is trying to scour through the list of green things and then try to pick a thing, to focus toward, or at least, like advocate for. So for example, like if you can get behind green energy, that would be a good focus there. Because ultimately the more people we have focusing toward these things and demanding these kind of things, the more that society will supply them. So for example, like I went vegan, and ultimately I know I'm just one person, but I do think that collectively, if more people go vegan, this creates a kind of, a desire for, the meat industry and dairy industries to not run the way that they do. Or, perhaps a desire for new technology in the form of lab-grown meat or something like that. So ultimately, we want to be looking forward to how to change society for the better. And when we do that, we'll be more open to the integration of the divine feminine. And we can embrace more feminine principle traits like caring and compassion and openness, receptivity, intuition. All of these things can come more into play the less ruthless our society is. So because we're currently in a state of divine feminine repression, basically the divine feminine, which is the feminine aspect of God, has been repressed down out of human society, for many thousands of years. And this has enabled us to grow as a society, but it has also been a major barrier to our wholeness as individuals and as society. So it's almost as though like all of those societies that have lived thus far have had to sacrifice a major part of themselves simply to survive. But now we're in a unique position to be able to integrate the divine feminine and to live in a society that just has a little bit more kindness and compassion and caring and, is more connected, where we have more sustainable solutions for things, where we actually have a deeper knowledge of how the emotions work and, might understand a little bit better about how to live a more fulfilling life. So I think that the integration of the divine feminine is really one of the most important topics there is to talk about today, and to really try to make space for that integration to occur. And ultimately, I think if we look at the spiral dynamics model, it really kind of shows us how that can start to happen on the societal level. Starting to see how, like social structures change and how things, at one phase maybe didn't work, but at another phase would. So it's really the case of us unlocking new possibilities and new potentials for ourselves as we evolve as a human society. And that's what's really, really exciting to me. So I think it's very important for us to start really supporting more green initiatives. So I think like just putting any kind of focus on that can only be a positive thing in terms of moving society forward. And of course, if you see somebody who is moving forward to another stage, like let's say if they were in red and they're moving to blue, well, don't mess with them about them. They're actually evolving quite well. That's all part of the shift. And so to look at things systemically and to see that this is basically the way that things happen, it kind of gives you a good idea of, what you can anticipate at each step along the way. And honestly, green is really the first time the feminine ever really starts to get reintegrated into the society. Basically the main impetus of all societies before that was to get as far away from the feminine as possible. But green is really the very first phase where the feminine is desirable, where it's important that we have the feminine integrated and it doesn't pose a huge threat to us. All of our issues before had to do with trying to get away from Mother Nature and trying to insulate ourselves, from such unpredictable forces that came from Mother Nature. And then now that, we get into green, when things have been very well, structured, like in, civilized to the point where Mother Nature has been, all but kept out, then it starts to be important for us to start to integrate Mother Nature. And we can even bring Yang technology into conjunction with Yin, Mother Nature, and so those things work together, and we as a human society can start to live more harmoniously and more authentically. Potentials that we may not have been able to realize before, we can now start to realize because our social structure is open enough for us to do so. And so I'm really excited about, the potential for unearthing new possibilities of humanity and to ultimately go toward a more conscious world where people are more in touch with the divine feminine and have a good idea of what emotions mean, and really like seeing those as valid and really focusing toward compassion and sustainability, living in harmony with nature. All of these types of things are very, very important aspects of the divine feminine that we're sorely missing from society and from ourselves too. So my recommendation is to personally try to bring yourself forward to a point where you can be open to the integration of the divine feminine and to help society do the same thing. Because ultimately we want to make sure that everybody can experience the divine feminine, everyone can access that part of themselves. That way the divine feminine isn't relegated to our own personal shadow or to the collective shadow. Also, there's a concept in alchemy that's called the sacred child. And that's basically where the divine masculine and the divine feminine come together, and through coming together, much like a man and a woman come together in intercourse, create a new child. Basically, the sacred child is the brand new system that comes in the conjunction of both the divine masculine and the divine feminine, which would be really a brand new social structure that I think that we're already embarking upon. And I think we've been on this journey for about 100 years, because what's going on now is so very different from what we have ever experienced before. So I think that, once we fully grow into that as a society and once we fully integrate, that it'll have wonderful implications for where we're going as a whole entire species and as our planet. But the thing that I'm worried about is that, I want to make it there in time before something negative happens. And we, basically I want to make sure that we can make the jump. Alright, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below, subscribe, write me a comment, share, all that jazz. Also, thank you again to my patrons. And until next time, keep becoming more you.